Awesome. So I'm here with my friend Jason Schulist. Jason, welcome.
Hey, welcome. Glad to be on your show.
Thanks for being here. And Jason, when people ask, what do you do? You're somebody that wears like so many different hats. You're somebody I talk about a lot because you're always doing these interesting projects. But how do you describe what you do and who you are?
Well, my purpose is to help people flourish and to kind of live to their fullest potential into their uniqueness. So when I was reflecting on this about maybe about 12 years ago, I had a personal coach who helped me. My goal of the personal coach was to have me get more stuff done. Her goal was to say, no, you got to figure out who you are. And so from that, I kind of created this thing that said, my goal is to help other people flourish to their fullest potential. And then I've been trying various ways of making that happen through my skills and then mashing them up. I like to DJ on the side, so I use a mashup metaphor to try and test different things to see if I can help more people flourish.
That's super cool. How do you describe flourishing?
So over time, what does flourishing mean? We've kind of come up with 8 different aspects of flourishing. So many people think, oh, I flourish economically. That's probably the least important of all the flourishing aspects. But there's physical, there's emotional, there's spiritual, there's mental. So if you think of those aspects, we're looking at how do we measure flourishing along those aspects, and then what can we do with money to really use money to apply that to help people flourish more.
Super cool. Now, you've built a few different models that sort of get at this concept of flourishing. And you've actually sort of applied these sort of concepts to a lot of the work that you've done in different communities. Can you talk about that from a high level perspective, and then maybe we could sort of dive down into like really specifically on the ground what that work looks like?
Sure. So the first, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So the first thing I think about is I started something called the Generative Local Community Institute. And the purpose of that is to really understand what is generative local community. And then what is generativity? Well, what we believe is generativity is people flourishing together. So when you flourish and I flourish, when we come together and do that on behalf of each other, we create even more than what we could do if we were just trying to flourish alone on a rock somewhere in the Himalayas by ourselves. So generative local community, then what is local? We've looked at all different aspects of local, and we looked at everything from a nation to a community to a borough, which we're now starting to think is more like a census tract, to a neighborhood. So how do we allow people to flourish together across all those domains? And then community are people together. And so we've created a model called the Generative Local Community Model to try to figure out a way to convert money into flourishing, and to do that in a way that we can invest in it one time and we don't have to keep coming back to the same nonprofits or the same foundations to ask for money again and again and again, but to really create an economic engine that allows us to sustainably create a community that's local that can then really focus on flourishing.
That is so cool, right? So you've got a one-time injection of cash, and through that, you're able to up and sort of see results in these different areas of flourishing that you've defined. How have you? And I know you're somebody that through your work and through your background, you're all about testing, you're all about iteration, you're all about prototyping. How have you tested this concept, and how have you sort of seen the byproduct of it start to work?
Right. One example of that is in Milwaukee. So we have looked and focused on building a generative business network. And what we believe is that a network of businesses that should be local should be managed together. And so what we have done is there's a laundromat, there's an incubator kitchen, there's a grocery store, there's a community center, there's a hydroponic food growing above a grocery store, all on the corner of Fond du Lac Avenue and Sherman Boulevard. And if you know that area, that's where pretty close to where the riots occurred in Milwaukee years ago when they blew up that gas station. And so the church there wanted to get involved and say, how can we do something different? I've been working with this community and with the people in this community to start thinking about how does that network cash flow positive. But the primary purpose of each one of those businesses is not to cash flow. That's the outcome that can be used, but it's to really drive a different experience and behavior around flourishing. So, for example, take a laundromat. The laundromat, yes, it cash flows positive relatively quickly, and people are sitting around for like an hour waiting for their laundry. What's the opportunity there? Oh, how do we help people dream? How do we help people understand their aspirations? When we go into different areas that people don't flourish, they even have a hard time thinking about dreaming. I'm like that little doll, like in Rudolph. I don't even have an ability to dream anymore because I'm on the island of misfit toys. No, we create space and place to connect people. We believe also, and there's a bunch of research that's going on, that when people talk about well-being and whether they're thriving, struggling, or suffering, the biggest lever to that is belonging and civic muscle. And so we've been spending a fair amount of time, both in our generative business network examples, but also in our local community here in the Fox cities of Wisconsin, understanding how belonging relates to flourishing or to well-being. And so we've been running tests with a belonging committee that's doing experimentation both at the neighborhood level to the community level to start saying, how do we create these spaces and places that enable us to have more belonging, which then enable us to have.
It's super cool. And how do you design for it in a way, right? Because it's like, it strikes me as one of those things where you know the research, you know how beneficial this is, you've seen the direct impact of it work out really, really well. But for somebody that maybe doesn't sort of belong to their community or doesn't sort of feel that sort of like civic connection, all those things that are so critical and important for well-being, it can be really sort of tough to maybe sort of get them outside their comfort zone or get them to do different things. How do you all design for that or sort of like think about that in terms of sort of making things accessible, making them sort of easy? How do you think about those on-ramps to sort of get people more involved and connected, and how have you seen that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could describe that in a couple ways. The first is we did develop a model for flourishing where the model is an acorn to oak tree model. And so if a person wants to flourish, everybody's acorn is you could call it any seed, but every acorn has its own uniqueness. And so, like, I know, Mike, you're a little bit taller than me. I'm probably not going to be in the NBA. So my flourishing oak tree is maybe not the same height as your flourishing oak tree, but it might have different breadth. So we all have a fullness of ourselves. And we look at both the sun being the purpose, that systems have purpose and people have purpose. And then we look at environmental conditions. And so that's where I want to focus some of what you were talking about. The environmental conditions are what we call the soil. So an acorn kind of sits in the soil. It germinates. It has to have a system. It has to have the nutrients inside the soil for it to grow. So how do you create deliberate structures, deliberate culture, deliberate ways of enhancing the ability for people to flourish? The second one is water. Water is the connection between people. So it kind of fits in between, if you put water in sand, it kind of goes in between or in rocks and it fills up the space. Deep connection allows people to connect with each other and allows people to work together on helping each other flourish. And then finally, air. If you think of an oak tree, right? An oak tree has carbon dioxide it takes in. You can't see it. It's kind of like, it's kind of invisible, but it turns into the carbon of the tree itself and makes it itself. We think of embodied learning being the same thing. I can go read a bunch of books and I can talk really well, but if I don't take that into action by embodying my learning, I don't become a new me. So embodied learning becomes the carbon that kind of builds into who I am as Jason. So when we work with people in the community, we're really working on designing those structures. So in a business or in an organization, you can design structures for an outcome. Same way you can do it for belonging, for flourishing, for that. So we do that both in the community as well as we've done it with other models to help people become exceptional within organizations. People have to be vulnerable and open and willing to take a step into experimenting and thinking about the world as a set of hypotheses. So almost everything we experience is made up somehow. Even our experience of nature comes through an interface, right? So it's not true nature; it's our described nature. And if you're colorblind and I'm not, we see nature in completely different ways. So it's all a story. And so, we can create our own narratives, and that's pretty cool. But we live and accept many of these stories. And so, by being curious and by being experimental, we can help to test those things that allow people to have better well-being.
That is so awesome and so inspiring. And sort of connecting it back to the example that you referenced in Milwaukee and the incredible work that you did there, or maybe sort of looking at another example. Can you walk us through what the sort of early education pieces look like about creating some buy-in for the model and creating this sort of conceptual understanding? I love the acorn oak tree metaphor. I love the sun, the soil, the ecosystem sort of metaphors that you're using. But when you're meeting with sort of community leaders or community members and you're doing some of these different education pieces, where do you start to create this kind of buy-in, right? Because I feel like people can hear the flourishing and be like, okay, yeah, we want that. But sort of knowing how to do it and understanding the metaphor may be sort of two different things. So what do those initial interventions look like? And then how do you start to really sort of make the thing live and workable?
Yeah, we've done, one way we've done that is through asking for feedback. So as we've built the generative local community model, we share that model, but we're saying we're looking for feedback, understanding how is this appropriate or not appropriate to the work you do. So there's a small YouTube video, kind of a 6-minute video on kind of this generative local community concept. And so taking that out and saying, hey, what do you think of this? We're actually running a second iteration this weekend and then republishing because we know we had a couple tweaks that we needed to make in the model based on the feedback we're getting. But we're getting feedback from, for example, I was talking to somebody who runs a foundation in San Diego yesterday and saying, hey, what do you think of this? How does this work? How does this fit with the model that you're working on? I'll be talking to someone who's also from San Diego, but from Estonia, and kind of mashing on that model, say, how do we get the feedback so that we're continuing to make it and improve? I find that, like you said, when you give a model and you give some stories with the model, like acorn to oak tree, I can give an example of like, why do I care about flourishing? It's because my 4th grade teacher gave me bad grades to get me out of the school that she didn't think would provide for me in the future, where my friend didn't, and he ended up not having the same kind of flourishing opportunities that I've had in my life. So you get these stories, and then you take the stories, connect them to the model. Most people resonate with this concept of wanting to flourish, resonate with this concept of this disconnection we see in our current environment, and want something more. And that gets them kind of a teaser into saying, well, look, and then here's what we've done. Here's what we're trying. We'd like you to try too, or we'd like to get you engaged and see if you'd be willing to try something so that we can move forward in helping everybody flourish and helping the world be generative.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think the approach is, I think, showing people that it's not like a zero-sum game, right? This is something that's sort of good for the community. This is something that it's not me versus you. It's sort of all boats are sort of lifting us to together. Can you walk us through, because I think your background is just like so fascinating, right? You went to MIT for your graduate work. You've done some really interesting things professionally. How has your background and your systems thinking and all the different things that you've done led you to this place of working and doing and really sort of letting, because you've got this very successful professional career. But when I talk to you, I mean, the thing that just jumps out in terms of sort of just passion, or the thing that just drives you so much is this incredible work that you've done in community and the spaces you've done there. how'd you get there, right? Like, because I think anybody sort of like looking can be like, wow, this is really cool and inspiring. But how, like, can you walk us through like what led you to really sort of getting to this space?
I'll give you a brief narrative of that history from a somewhat a quasi-business perspective, and that might help to share. So first of all, growing up in a rougher part of Milwaukee really created this desire to not stay in that environment over time. So that was an impetus. But then my social sustainability side has really been focused on there's so many people in those environments that are that don't get the same chances. And I'm a white guy, so that like gave me like 3 extra coins to play the lottery with. But at the same time, there were still a lot of white guys in the neighborhood that have had a completely different trajectory. But if I was black, in that neighborhood, my chances would even be harder. So I empathize with that space, first of all. Then went into General Motors because they paid the most. And so, looking at stability. But I asked them, like, how do you get ahead in a company like General Motors, at the time, the biggest company in the world? They're like, one guy's like, oh, you need your MBA. And then General Motors were sending people for engineering degrees, for Masters of Engineering. So I signed up, got lucky enough to get chosen. And so I found a place where I could get 2 degrees, an MBA and a master's. And I did that at MIT. So here's this like electrical engineering guy who's like totally, if you know the Myers-Briggs ESTJ, kind of like, everything's black and white. There's nothing going on. And when you get to MBA school, they say, you know what, you should really go and work for McKinsey, because that's like the, MBA. You can either go finance, McKinsey. You don't want to be in this like silly automotive world or business world. You want to like, feed off of the business world. So a buddy of mine says, there's this class called Dialogue Learning and the Consulting Practice. It's got consulting in it. You probably should take that. So I go to this class, and it's actually a class on dialogue based on David Bohm, who's like a quantum physicist from England that did work in dialogue. And then Bill Isaacs, who wrote the book on dialogue, hadn't written it yet, but wrote it based on his classes he was giving, talked about how do you get into this whole new space. I'm like, whoa, this isn't like engineering space anymore. Something completely different. Well, Peter Senge was like a guest speaker, and he's the guy that did learning organization work and Society of Organizational Learning. So he comes in as a guest speaker, and then I kind of start digging into him, because I'm like, you're supposed to be like transparent, but you're in this like separate building in MIT I can't get access to. And so then I end up with a relationship with Peter Senge. And then General Motors sends me to Poland to start a factory from the ground up. And so I'm going to have, 500-600 people reporting to me. I had none when I got there. I had to build this whole thing up. And I wanted to do this as a learning organization. So I'm like, I want to create shared vision and mental model work and left-hand columns while we're building cars. And I also wrote a paper then about Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a corporation, which talked about like, what's the role of a corporation? They're bigger. General Motors is bigger than, or not bigger than like all but 20 countries at the time, from a GDP perspective. Like, how do you think about that, right?
Yeah.
What's the role? So try to do that. Played with that a little bit, but in the end, like my boss, like, no, go back and make cars. I'm like, dude, I only came here because I wanted to do this. Spent the last 2 years kind of setting the table. So I went to work at corporate strategy at General Motors. And so that's the kind of place where like the guy that's like a beautiful mind that rocks in his chair was in there. The chief economist was in there. And then some young up and coming people in the company. So we're learning about game theory applied to business situations. We're learning about genetic algorithms, and we're learning about complexity theory, which was relatively new in the late 90s, and how to apply complexity theory into business world. How do you do system dynamics modeling? How do you do all this kind of stuff? And so it's like this little Petri dish of problem solving. And so that kind of kept me on this journey past that, related to problem solving, and always thinking about how do you address problems and what's the right toolkit. And so then they sent me to London. I go do business deals in technology. So I got to do like technology business deals. I taught CNN how to sell its content, and designed the content selling, because we wanted to buy it at General Motors to put on our OnStar phones in Europe. So that was really cool and learned a lot about that type of stuff. Then became a house husband for 10 months in Warsaw, Poland with my newlywed wife who was working. Normally it's like, an expat and the Polish wife is the one that's sitting at home. I was like, I'd go to these events and they'd be scared of me because I'm like, what do you do? I was like, well, my Polish wife works. I've just come to the American Friends of Warsaw thing. It's a bunch of women in 7,000 square foot houses. They protect their kids and kept them away from me because they didn't know who I was. I said, yeah, so I'm just sitting here hanging out, and she's my sugar mama. So that gave me 70 books to read on kind of philosophy, physics, quantum physics. And so I spent a lot of time doing that kind of research. We ended up going back and running my parents' business for a couple of years for kind of pro bono to help them kind of grow their business. But then we had a kid, went to a utility company. So now I've gone from automotive to network, and the last one was fulfillment, was the business that my parents had. So like fulfillment, how do you solve problems? And the utility, it's about a network. How do you solve network problems? Because you're trying to keep the lights on, you're trying to keep the gas to people's homes and all that. Ran the continuous improvement, saved $800 million bottom line in about 3-4 years. During the economic crisis, we had one of the best years ever. There's good stories about it. But we were really trying to build capability in people to solve problems. And so we could solve problems there. Got interested then about taxonomy of problem solving. Maybe I'm just talking too much here, but I'm kind of getting...
This is awesome. No, keep going. Yeah, the taxonomy piece is fascinating.
Oh, wait a minute. There's different categories of problems. Like if I drop a ball, normally it's going to fall unless there's a magnet under there and I'm a magician, and then it levitates, right? So I have all these rules that I have to follow, and there's simple things to solve. And most companies solve the simple stuff, right? Because you can take waste out. Toyota's really good at this, but they don't necessarily look at the system all the time. So that's where I did a lot of system work, system dynamics, and you start to link things together. But that still missed 2 quadrants of the way that we could sense the world. So I found the Canavan model. So David Snowden was a few years ahead of me on this problem, thinking about this problem. But he has a sensing model of how to think about the world, and it's clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And that whole complex space is where it gets really interesting, because you can't use the tools in complicated and simple the same way and expect to get an outcome. The reason is, in complexity science, there aren't answers unless you know all the initial conditions, which we hardly ever know unless you start a system that's very controlled and contained. So the world is a complex adaptive system. When you work on poverty, it's a complex adaptive problem. It's not, you can't just like, oh, poverty, just give them money and it's all solved. No, it doesn't work there. So I really started to explore, how do you really address problems? You can't solve them in complexity. You can only address them and change the patterns of behaviors necessary to make things happen. So I spent some time in the local area working on a poverty initiative where we really gained a bunch of multi-stakeholders together in a room, ran multiple experiments, tested those outside the room, came back and then shared the learning so that you could focus on the ability to make transformational change with even small improvements. If you go to Stanley McChrystal's work on like Team of Teams, they used a very similar approach to get El Zarqawi. They didn't have time to understand and look at the data all the time. They had to bring all the data in the room and then make decisions quick. Otherwise, they never would have captured/eliminated him during the time that they were pursuing him. So it's using a different model to approach different problems. And so for me, the entire arc has been, whether I've been in a company running their operational excellence or continuous improvement, or running a factory, or when I'm doing poverty work or doing work in a community to help a community thrive. It's all about thinking about the type of problem and then applying the appropriate systems and tools to get an outcome to occur.
That's fascinating. So, and the complexity piece is a really interesting one, right? Because you've got these dynamic systems where variables affect one another in ways that can be unpredictable or absolutely sort of impossible to control. So it's not the chaos quadrant that you're talking about where you have no control, but it is one where, the inputs and outputs just aren't simple at all. The levers are very, very complicated and interwoven. How have you, when you're thinking about the work that you're doing sort of in flourishing, how are you leveraging that model, right? What are the factors that you're paying really close attention to? How are you keeping all these different variables in mind with your model? And can you walk us through some of the sort of testing that you're doing to really sort of understand what the dynamics look like, right? Because I think for a lot of people, that can be a hard thing to wrap your mind around, right? It's just like, you're introduced one thing and it has all these unintended consequences, right? So it's not just like first principles, second order thinking. You're like 3, 4, and 5 things down when you're doing this. So when you're thinking about testing or interventions or these different pieces, where's your mind going? How do you control for what you can control there?
Yeah, I'll give you an example and talk a little bit. So first of all, chaos is normally easy to observe. You just don't know when it's going to happen. So like an earthquake happens, a volcano happens, a school shooting. These are all things that are not really highly controllable, but likely to happen in certain environments. So like if you don't have guns, the school shootings don't happen very much. And so you don't see a lot of school shootings in other countries than the United States. But you're going to expect another school shooting is going to occur somewhere. And so you can figure out ways to manage chaos. Are you still there, Mike?
Yeah, sorry.
Complexity is a little bit harder because you don't think about it so much. But like damn humans, they have free will. So even if you're doing economics, you hope that there's some ideal way of people are going to behave, and they don't. And so that's complex. And why don't they? Well, there's lots of reasons for that. So an example of work that I did a while ago was around poverty and understanding in our area how to reduce poverty. And one of the things we realized is that people needed to have living wage jobs, not surprisingly, to get out of poverty. So do we have any of those in the area? And we're like, oh, we have thousands of living wage jobs that are open. And this was pre-COVID. Do we have anybody who doesn't have a job? Oh, we have thousands of people who don't have jobs. Oh, why don't we just take the people and put them in the job, take a person? It wouldn't it be so easy, if it was a very simple problem, you just put, if you were, I guess, in communism, you just tell people go work because it's a controlled environment or an autocracy, and you can just do it, right? Go to the, if you're Russian, go to the front. You have been conscripted, right? So even then, right, they're having a hard time managing, Russia is managing the people they've conscripted to do what they want them to do. So we were looking at matching individuals to jobs, and we're like, oh, well, let's hold a job fair. We could find the people that don't have jobs. We could find the companies that do. So we went work with the company and said, let's do a job fair. And so we worked with a local nonprofit that had people that were looking for jobs. We had this company that did it. And so we set up this job fair, and 15 people said they were going to go to the job fair. Job fair happens. Nobody shows up. We're like, what's going on here? Nobody showed up. They agreed to show up. Of course, they're going to fulfill their reliable commitments to show up to a job fair. And so we said, okay, let's call every one of those people. What happened? Why? Okay, one was transportation. I couldn't get there. I didn't have it. But most of them were like, this is scary. I've never been to a job fair, and this is for a manufacturing company that's like Fern Gully. It's going to like chomp and eat me up and spit me out, and I'm going to work like the jungle and from the meat packing industry of 1910. And I'm sure they weren't thinking that, but I don't know. It's scary. I don't have a resume. I don't even know how to dress. And so what we found is, people have trauma. The main reason they don't have a job isn't because they can't find one. The main reason they don't have a job is because they have lots of barriers to really integrating into the system. So we said, let's run another experiment. We shared that experiment with a bunch of different businesses so they don't just run fruitless job fairs for people. So we said, we need what we call a handler. So now we have a handler that, we call it, but a person who knows the people that are going to go to the job fair, that they trust, they feel comfortable with, and they brought them over, run another job fair. Oh, like half the people come to the job fair. Great. But they still are trying to do their resume. They have a formal presentation, and they have this like, wait a minute, that still is like corporate, and that's not necessarily meeting the trauma-informed needs of the people. So the next thing was, we're going to run them on a tour. You don't need to bring a resume, but you can fill out an application. By the way, if you like it, we'll give you a job today if we think there's a fit. Completely change that. Now other companies learn from that. They can do the same thing. And so we end up getting more people on there. So a success was a person got a job through this process. And then 90 days later, they're going to go get their benefits, right? And it's a young person, first time they've had a job, but they get benefits. And so they come up with benefits like, I don't need benefits. My parents have benefits. Why do I have to get benefits? I'm going to decline the benefits. So they decline the benefits, not realizing that their parents have benefits because no one works in the house. And now that they work in the house, they're going to lose their benefits from the person who just got the job that just declined the benefits that they wanted. So we realized, we need to make sure that we have a very specific training package when people are about to get benefits so they understand the implications of what they're doing. And then every other company in the area could also learn from that. And now we rise, like you said, all boats higher because we're running iterative experiments over and over into a group of people who care about solving a problem so that they can change the patterns that might be pervasive because we're running from an old paradigm.
That's such a fabulous example. And that curiosity that you have to dive a little bit deeper and follow up and ask not one question, not two questions, but 3-4 questions and try 3 or 4 iterations is why the thing works, right? You have to really sort of dig deeper to really sort of understand the complexity of these problems. And anybody that does, I think, that knows design thinking or does, lean design or these other sort of like conceptual pieces and is able to sort of apply them in different pieces. I think that's a really sort of awesome learning takeaway. I know you've got sort of short time today, because I know you're always sort of running to different places, but where can people learn more about you, learn more about different pieces that you're doing, and maybe learn more about the work that you're doing in generativity and community work?
Yeah, you could go to genlocal.org, GEN local, generativelocal.org. That's a website that has some of this information there. Also on YouTube, there's a Generative Local Community Institute channel. So you can go to that channel. And that, interestingly enough, that channel has videos from something called Skills Fest, where we basically were convening people at Lawrence University for a few years to think about this space. The videos are totally like lo-fi. So I'm not as good as Mike O'Connor's studio type of work, but just it gives content. And the point is, we want to get more content out there. There's also this generative local community video on YouTube that's on that channel that is recent, and that's what we're looking at taking to communities to see if this is a solution that can help people flourish better together by running a generative local business network in their community, kind of run as a cooperative.
Awesome.
So those are some of the places you can reach. Jason at genlocal.org. That's also a way to communicate with me.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to link to all those places. Jason, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, thank you. It was a pleasure. And I really appreciate what you do, Mike, and how you're helping the world flourish as well. Thanks for what you do to make the world extraordinary.
Trying, my friend. Trying. Thank you.